Good afternoon. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. I should also say good evening, and those of you on the East Coast or even in the Midwest. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of the leadership team at America at a Crossroads, I welcome you to tonight's program. Joining me in leadership is former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome back to tonight's guest, the great Mary Ziegler, who is one of the country's foremost scholars and experts on the subject of the law and politics of reproductive rights. And of course, welcome to our wonderful moderator, Pat Morrison. I wanted to spend a couple minutes on upcoming programs. We have two September programs which more or less coincide with the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, and we have some other very exciting programs in September. The two Oslo-related programs, one is on September 11th, and that's actually next Thursday, not Wednesday. Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, Aluf Ben, will be with us again, together with Warren Olney, discussing can the two-state solution be resurrected. The second program about Oslo is on September 30th, the day before Yom Kippur, from 10 to 11:30 a.m., which is very different from our usual time, that's Pacific time. Judge is co-sponsoring a program entitled 30 Years Since Oslo. Why did the Accords fail and can the Israeli-Palestinian peace process be salvaged? The program is being produced by UCLA's Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, UC Berkeley's Diller Institute for Israel Studies, and the UCLA Center for Middle East Development. And they're producing this program in co-sponsorship with us. And you can register for both of those programs in the email that you'll get right after tonight's program. Also in September, we have David Frum coming on September 17th with Patt Morrison, talking about our democracy and where we go from here. We have a great program with the new UCLA Chancellor, Julio Frank, who will be in conversation with Larry Mantle, and that's September 25th. Can America's universities survive the current assault? And that should be an outstanding program as well. And then we have a very special program on October 9th, a 90-minute program from 5 to 6:30, which we are co-sponsoring with a number of organizations. It's called Raids, Rights, and Reckonings, America's Immigration Crossroads, with a former Secretary of U.S. Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, Miguel Santana from the California Community Foundation, and Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Truah, a rabbinic call for human rights. The moderator is Jonathan Blitzer, who's at the New Yorker, where he covers immigration and has written books, and he's a spectacular writer. And it's going to be a really outstanding program. We hope you'll all sign up for all those programs. You can do so in the email you'll get at the conclusion of tonight's program. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's moderator, Patt Morrison. Pat is well known to this audience as a superstar, multi-award-winning broadcast journalist and a writer and columnist with the Los Angeles Times. Pat, thank you for your commitment to America at a Crossroads. We really appreciate you. The show is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you to all the sponsors, to all the supporters, and all of you who are watching us here this afternoon, this evening. It's always an honor to be on these programs and to interview these high-profile and very important voices that you turn here to see and to listen to. Tonight, it's Mary Ziegler, the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis, the author of 6 books on the law, history, politics of abortion and American conservatism. Tonight's book under discussion, Personhood, the New Civil War Over Reproduction. Mary, thank you again for coming back and joining us.
Yeah, of course. I love coming.
Define, I suppose, fetal personhood, which is not only the topic of much of your book, but an evolution in what has often been characterized as the war over reproductive rights.
Yeah, so personhood as a concept could mean a lot of different things to different people. There are obviously different points of view on when human life begins or has meaning in different faith traditions like Judaism, in bioethics and medicine. The claim I mean is a legal claim, right? So that the word person in particular legal context, especially the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, applies the moment an egg is fertilized. And so fetal personhood is, in some ways, has always been the ultimate objective of the anti-abortion movement, going back to the 1960s. And why it's important to know that now is that explains why the demise of Roe v. Wade really wasn't the endpoint for the anti-abortion movement, and why almost daily you see stories about states trying to find ways to project their power across state lines. You see conservative groups going to federal court. It's because the end game is something much bigger than letting each state make its own decision, which was nominally what getting rid of Roe was about.
As I was reading your book, I was wondering whether, in fact, fetal personhood was deliberately chosen kind of as a diversionary or a smokescreen presentation, because it really isn't about fetus in the way that many people think of it, which is 6, 7, 8 months along, something that does resemble a human being. It is personhood from the moment of conception, just a few, 4, 6, 8, 12 cells, whatever the DNA doubling is there, that's what personhood is to this movement.
Yeah, that's right. And that point about when personhood begins to the movement is an indicator of how much more than abortion is really at stake when we think about fetal personhood being recognized, whether that's by judges or whether that's by state judges or whether that's by state lawmakers. And that what that tells you is that it's not just abortion, it's going to be in vitro fertilization, because of course embryos that are created are very early being stored or after fertilization, right? They're fertilized embryos. There's a belief among some conservatives that the morning after pill falls into the same category because they believe that it kicks in after an egg is fertilized, but before it implants. So the stakes of fetal personhood obviously are major when it comes to the criminalization of abortion everywhere, including places like California. But the stakes are also high for things having little on the surface to do with abortion whatsoever, like infertility treatment.
I want to get a lot more into IVF a little later in the program, but um, it sounds like if you were to tell people, tell American voters what this is really about, this is not a politically easy thing to sell,
Right.
because you already have a public that is not happy about the Dobbs decision in many cases. And generally Americans have polled over the decades consistently in favor of abortion rights up to a certain point. That's when you begin to lose support. But the idea that, and now this is going to apply to a half dozen cells, pretty hard to put across to the public.
Yeah, and that's by design, right? One of the really interesting moves you see, and I think people will recognize this intuitively. There was a lot of reporting when Donald Trump ran on a platform that did not call for a fetal personhood constitutional amendment. And reporters at the time sort of heralded this as a sign of Trump's moderation on abortion. What they missed is that the platform instead suggested that the Constitution already recognized constitutional fetal rights. And the reason that pivot was made was not just to confuse people, it was also because abortion opponents understand full well that voters are not going to go for this, right? There's not going to be a constitutional amendment because that would require voters to go along. But if it's the argument is you have to convince judges this is what the Constitution already means, that may not happen either, but it's a lot easier to imagine the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority eventually going for this argument than it would be for the American people going for it, which I agree is not, this is a non-starter.
If you have questions for Mary about this or reproductive politics in general, please put your question in the Q&A chat, who you are, where you're from, and we'll get to those a little later in the program. But right now, I'd like to find out what the political origin of this movement is, because as you point out in the book, from a practical point of view in colonial and early America, the notion of abortion up to the point of quickening, which may be what, about 4 months, when the woman feels a fetus moving, that was like okay. I don't know whether it was approved of, but it certainly wasn't criminalized and it wasn't codified into any kind of law. But then that began to change, certainly in the mid-19th century, the Victorian era. So maybe you can talk about the historical evolution of that.
Yeah, so it's in the 19th century, that was when you had the first anti-abortion movement, but it wasn't really a fetal personhood movement in the modern sense. And that's actually really important because the fetal personhood movement today wants to say, at the time the 14th Amendment was written, everybody thought that fetuses had constitutional rights. And if you're an originalist judge, you have to think the same thing. That doesn't seem to be right. And there were a number of reasons for that. But the physicians who organized to criminalize abortion in the 19th century had a bunch of motives for doing it. They were convinced that life began at fertilization. They were angry that midwives were out competing them. They were anxious that Catholics were having more babies and Jews to some extent than Protestants. They were upset that married women were not having sex and having an unlimited number of babies on demand. So they saw criminalizing abortion as a way to address all of these goals. But what they didn't say was that they were obligated by the Constitution to do that. And in fact, they complained a lot that Americans didn't see the point of doing this, right? That Americans didn't agree with them about when life began, that Americans were having lots of abortions anyway. And that seems to have been true, that the abortion rate continued to be high. It was also really hard at the time to enforce abortion laws because no one really had a reliable way of knowing when you were pregnant before fetal movement was detectable. Doctors would do reliable and not at all ridiculous things like look inside your nose to see if you were pregnant, which was, of course, like arousing six. Everybody figured it out 100% of the time. No one was ever wrong. No, there was no argument really by states criminalizing abortion that they were constitutionally obligated to do it. The doctors who were arguing for these criminal laws didn't talk about the Constitution either. So the idea that this is mandated by the Constitution is something that didn't really come along until the 1960s, when you had a very different anti-abortion movement. The early anti-abortion movement, to be kind of break it down simply, consisted predominantly of conservative Protestant, white, relatively well-to-do physicians. And the 1960s movement consisted overwhelmingly of Catholics, and often people with direct connections to the Catholic Church. That movement had been arguing for a long time that abortion shouldn't be accessible, either because it was immoral or because it would lead to sexual promiscuity. And by the 1960s, that argument had become much less effective. So Catholic leaders began looking for a way to say essentially that states could not choose to legalize abortion, even if that's what voters wanted. And they argued that that was the case because, in fact, the unborn child or fetus was a minority against whom the law would discriminate, much like a person of color, much like a woman. So the gesture was, instead of saying this is about gender roles or this is about the roles of physicians, the argument was to say that, in fact, the real civil rights movement in America was one on behalf of fetuses, right? As opposed to all of the other civil rights movements that were very active in the 1960s.
In fact, when the New Yorker was writing about your book, it referred to boundless tactical resourcefulness of the legal movement, of the personhood movement, because it would latch on to one argument, and if that one was knocked down, then it would find another one, like the 14th Amendment. And it just seemed to be morphing in how it approached the argument to tailor it to the audience and to the legal opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's both I think one of the things that comes across when you study this history is how um, innovative and effective abortion opponents have been, but also I think how fetal personhood has kind of had this hold on conservatives' imaginations for a long time. Because one of the things I kept being asked when writing the book was, isn't this just like a ploy, right? Don't these people sit in rooms and twirl their mustaches and say this is actually about controlling women? And the short answer to that is no, right? That people may have other motives in their desire to criminalize abortion, but that they talk about fetal rights when they're with one another in strategy sessions and emails. So for some reason, this idea that the real victim of discrimination was not pregnant women who were being denied emergency care, and was not people of color, and wasn't any of the people you would ordinarily think of. That was really compelling to people. And it was also vague enough, right? What it meant to say a fetus was a person was never fully fleshed out, right? It was never clear how you would enforce that, how you would treat pregnant people as a result of that, who would be punished if that was true, if anybody needed to be punished. So it also ended up being sort of a canvas onto which people could project all kinds of other ideas. So it was both strategic ingenuity, and it was also, I think, a function of how personhood became kind of a mirror of how a lot of conservatives thought of a lot of other issues over the course of really almost a half century.
And there was a sense of, you referred to the punitiveness against women, which has always been the case when it comes to abortion and contraception, that you should pay the wages of your sin. Never mind that there's another sinner on the other side of the bed who's getting off without many of the consequences. But the idea that the women become, throughout this argument, different. They are victims of what you call big abortion, the way we refer to big pharma now, or the idea that they're these wicked creatures who don't love children, who care nothing for children. That too has changed over time as the personhood movement has found it useful.
Yeah, and it's under pressure now. So one of the things that's become a real, I think, sensitive point for abortion opponents and a point of division since Roe was overturned is whether personhood requires you to punish women because they're sinners or just because they've taken the rights of a fetal person. And the movement's divided about that. There's a wing of the movement that identifies as abolitionist that argues essentially if in fact fetuses are rights holding people, you have to punish women. And in fact, you have to punish women for murder, right? That anything less than that, it contradicts the principle of fetal personhood. And there are other people in the movement, most of the leaders of the larger groups, who think that that's pragmatically just political suicide, who argue instead that ultimately, at least at the moment, women are the second victims of abortion because the abortion industry is sophisticated enough to hoodwink them and can such that they don't know what they're doing. This is an inherently unstable position, of course, right? Because in theory, there will come a time when people know what they're doing, even if they don't know what they're doing now. And then it will be very difficult, I think, for the movement to justify why women shouldn't be punished. So that reckoning, if fetal person is recognized, I think is coming. There were lots of conversations I had both on and off the record with people about the contemporary debates about personhood that reinforce that that's really the case.
What is it that so invests people in being part of this movement? Obviously, there's a religious factor, but what else is afoot? Because we're hearing a lot now about, oh, America has such a low birth rate, we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves as a nation. There are lots of motives going on in this movement, I would think.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think there were people who were attracted to the movement for religious reasons. Initially, obviously Catholics, but they're now, I think now the movement is primarily associated with conservative Protestantism. Their views about gender, their views about race, right? I mean, for a movement that's making claims about being a civil rights movement, you have to have, I think, by definition, views about what civil rights mean in other contexts. The relationship between the anti-abortion movement and pronatalism is also really interesting because the anti-abortion movement is a coalition with a bunch of folks who don't necessarily get along, and so is the what's turning into the pronatalist movement. So, crudely speaking, right, you have people who are pronatalist because they're opposed to abortion. So, in other words, pronatalism may be um, important because it means fewer people are having abortions and more people are having babies. There are people who are pronatalist because they are nativist and they want to have jobs and certain functions satisfied without people being allowed to cross our borders. There are kind of tech bro pronatalists who have their own agenda and wanting people to have more children. And so I think exactly how that lines up with the anti-abortion movement's agenda is really complicated. It has been historically and it is now. I think you see that playing out in part because a lot of the kind of what would nominally be considered pro-family anti-abortion leaders want to see the Trump administration do more to kind of incentivize people to have children, for example, by rolling out paid family leave, which is not going to happen in the era of Doge, right? We're going to see fewer things paid for, and for the most part, with obvious exceptions, and not more things paid for. So how exactly you achieve pronatalism, other than doing what the anti-abortion movement has done in defining personhood, which is essentially to criminalize things in new ways, to expand the scope of people who are punished, to pass redundant criminal laws, like Texas now has a big mega bill that will introduce yet more penalties for people who mail or possess or manufacture abortion pills. That's been the way we've been doing this. And whether that changes, I think, it seems unlikely in the near term.
We have some terrific questions lining up for when I get to that part of the program with Mary. You can put your question in the Q&A box and we'll get around to that as well. One thing that has played into this movement is a 150-year-old law called the Comstock Law, which should have been taken off the books years ago by all accounts, but is still on the books, and there are a lot of people in the present administration and its supporters pushing to reestablish this, to reinforce it, and to put it back as a tool in the hands of federal and state authorities. Tell us what the Comstock Law is and what the implications are.
Yeah, so the Comstock Act was named after Anthony Comstock, who was a 19th century anti-smut crusader. So it was primarily targeted at any item that conservative Protestants like Comstock thought to be obscene. So that included plays by George Bernard Shaw, it included the Decameron, it included, the Venus de Milo, it included most medical textbooks involving nudity. It included fun things like graphic depictions of venereal disease because, it had something to do with sex. It also included items related to the prevention of conception, the procuring of abortion, or what a kind of catch-all for any other item for an indecent or immoral use. Again, because no one really knew how drugs were working at the time. If a drug was preventing pregnancy, helping you regulate your period, ending a pregnancy, no one knew. So the Comstock Act's been largely gone into disuse when it comes to abortion. There have not really been abortion-related Comstock Act prosecutions, much to speak of since the 19-teens. But Congress never repealed language in the Comstock Act mentioning abortion. So the anti-abortion movement argues that it is still a federal crime today to mail or receive any item related to abortion, whether that's medical equipment that would be used in a surgical abortion or drugs that are
Or
used.
even could be used, not necessarily
Exactly. And the
suggested.
other thing that's important is it's not just folks mailing the stuff, right? So if you're thinking of doctors or drug companies, it's receiving it. So this would be a scenario where anybody, including a woman who orders abortion pills online, would be guilty of a federal felony. So the reason this is important to the anti-abortion movement is it operates a lot like fetal personhood in the sense that abortion opponents don't believe that even Congress now, with the Trump administration and the Supreme Court, will pass a law banning abortion at fertilization, especially one with no exceptions that allows the punishment of women, which is what they say the Comstock Act is. So they're sort of trying to resurrect and reread the Comstock Act to be the abortion ban they know they can never get democratically. Historically, that's not really what the Comstock Act seemed to have been. Even back in the day, courts interpreted it to allow for some mailing of abortion-related items for health reasons. So this is an interpretation of the Comstock Act that's sort of a 21st century invention.
Mhm.
But it's there because all it would need to work would be the sign off of the US Supreme Court and the willingness of the Trump administration to enforce it. At the moment, the Trump administration is not saying or doing anything on this, but that could change soon. So whether the Comstock Act is in fact an abortion ban is a question that's been posed to Matthew Kacsmaryk, who you all may remember as the most anti-abortion judge in America. He's a federal judge in the district court in Amarillo, Texas. There's a case that's been filed before him by the attorneys general of Idaho, Missouri, and Kansas, and was recently joined by the attorneys general of Kansas and Florida, that relies on the Comstock Act to say that mailing mifepristone or telehealth access to mifepristone, a drug used in the vast majority of abortions in the United States, violates federal law. So whether the Trump administration wants to deal with this or not, the federal courts may force his hand this year.
And this is, as you say, particularly relevant now, far more than 150 years ago, because the vast majority of abortions are done by medication abortions, which for many people are obtained online through telehealth. And there was a case in, I think was it Texas, that went after a New York physician because she had prescribed for a woman in Texas through telehealth an abortion pill. And Texas wanted her arrested, wanted to fine her $100,000, and New York said, no, you shall not pass. But this is the new reality with telehealth, telemedicine, and these laws that are arguably state laws, but that try to reach across state lines.
Yeah, so the Comstock Act is meant to be the kind of silver bullet for abortion opponents when it comes to this kind of brewing civil war when it comes to abortion pills. So we're starting to see individuals filing lawsuits against doctors in blue states. So there's now a lawsuit that's been filed against a doctor in California. There's a lawsuit that's been filed by the state of Texas against a doctor in New York. Louisiana is trying to criminally prosecute that same New York doctor. But the problem for red states in that scenario is that it's not clear which state's laws apply. It's not clear when the blue state has to honor a judgment from the red state. So, and even if a red state wins or an individual conservative plaintiff wins, that doesn't mean they'll win the next case. So, as far as conservative states are concerned, that means abortion pills are kind of a game of whack-a-mole where they have to kind of constantly beat down efforts to get these pills and make them accessible to people in their states. There's even a network of doctors, so-called shield doctors, who are deliberately organizing as a form of civil disobedience to mail these pills into states where they're criminal. But the Comstock Act would sort of solve the problem because if the Supreme Court is asked, do you honor the law of New York, or do you honor the law of Texas? That's a really tricky question in many cases legally. If the question is it the federal law or New York law? That's easy most of the time. The federal law will preempt the state law. So that's why there's so much interest in the Comstock Act. It's a way of getting conservative states out from what will otherwise be a giant mess where the federal courts will have to weigh in on a lot of complicated questions about conflicts of law and the full faith and credit clause. And it will make the kind of pre-Roe era look like a picture of simplicity and ease, I think, for federal judges.
Speaking of giant mess, we got a taste of what fetal personhood might mean in practice with an Alabama Supreme Court ruling about an IVF clinic, which said, nope, they're all children for legal purposes. They're just the same as grown-up, actual walking around, breathing human beings. And it set off a panic in the IVF community because of liability, because of all kinds of problems that this created. And therefore, there was a hasty retreat from it because, as you point out in the book, more than 40% of Americans either have had IVF dealings or know people who have had IVF dealings. This is a pro-family technology that was being challenged by people who were adopting this fetal personhood, absolute 100% attitude.
Yeah, so the Alabama Supreme Court decision, which was called LePage, was decided in February of last year, and it relied on the idea that fetuses can be people even outside of the context of the 14th Amendment. So the court said, we just think embryos, in this case they were earlier, are people with rights under this wrongful death law. But therefore, if you accidentally destroy an embryo, you can be sued for millions of dollars, which is why IVF shut down. And the politics of IVF afterward go to show you how potent in some ways fetal personhood is. So on the one hand, of course, politicians across the ideological spectrum rush to express their support for IVF. Donald Trump has declared that he's the fertilization president. We've seen both Republicans and Democrats propose kind of pro-IVF legislation. But then we've also seen that nothing has actually happened, right? President Trump has pledged that we're going to get this pro-IVF policy rollout. That was months ago, and it's never been rolled out. None of the legislation.
We'll see it.
Yeah, none of this legislation on IVF has passed. And that's partly because the anti-abortion movement, instead of looking at what happened in Alabama and saying, oops, maybe this is a deeply unpopular policy we should retreat from, has doubled down on the idea that IVF as it's currently practiced is unacceptable and therefore, because it's inconsistent with fetal personhood. So the Heritage Foundation has rolled out plans to transform how IVF is practiced. Students for Life and other large anti-abortion groups are doing this, and they argue that this is important both on its own, right, because they see IVF as it's currently practiced as morally indefensible, and also because it's a step toward fetal personhood in other contexts, right? It's they say logically inconsistent to say you can create as many embryos as you want and store them for as long as you want, and then say that you can't have an abortion. So the argument is if there's going to be consistency, IVF is going to have to change. How would it have to change is a little bit disputed. Some folks in the movement want to prohibit it altogether. Some folks in the movement want to ensure that you can only implant one embryo at a time and not store any additional embryos, which would make IVF dramatically less effective and more expensive. It's already, as many of you know, prohibitively expensive for many Americans, and therefore predominantly available to privileged people, predominantly available to white people. So that dynamic would be magnified considerably if that proposal went all the way.
If you extend this 100% to the zygote, to the moment of conception, you create very difficult scenarios, as you have alluded to. It's the same thing with abortion, where women do not even at 6 weeks often know whether or not they're pregnant. But it made me think of a moment from that. It's a 20-year-old movie now, 25 years old, Legally Blonde, where there's a
Mhm.
classroom argument about a sperm donor demanding parental visitation rights. And Elle Woods, the protagonist, says, for that matter, any masturbatory emissions where the sperm is clearly not seeking an egg could be termed reckless abandonment. Everybody laughed at that, but this does not seem too far-fetched if you're talking about how far we're willing to go in some quarters because of fetal personhood.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really struck me in writing the book was, if you stop to think, why does this argument sometimes have weight? And I think why it is because there are a number of Americans, and this shows up in polling, who will say things like, I think life begins at conception, and then will say, but of course IVF shouldn't be criminal, and of course abortion shouldn't be criminal. So one of the things that this story tells us is just how absolutely weird American attitudes about the meaning of life are, right? That we look at this and say, some of us look at ultrasounds and see a baby, right? And some of us think life in the womb has value. And the way we translate that in the US abortion debate is not by doing more for pregnant women or doing more for women generally or doing more for parents generally, right? Just to make it more attractive to have children or make it easier for people who have children to do it, or even to target people who we know have a particularly hard time raising children, like people who are facing racism or poverty. Instead, we've decided that we should just criminalize the people we see as the transgressors. So that's also weird, right? That instead of saying, going earlier and earlier in life, in kind of the process of creating life and saying that's a person, or, thinking about what it would mean to value life in a way that would actually work, we're sort of, I think, fixated, or at least a lot of abortion opponents are fixated on the idea that the only way we do equality and justice in this country is punishment, which I think is deeply problematic in this context, but we see it being deeply problematic, I think, in a variety of other contexts too.
So much of the argument that seems to come across for fetal personhood is a zero-sum argument when it comes to women. Women tend to get lost or diminished in this process. They're either, as you say, the victims of unscrupulous doctors, or they're morally loose women, or they're like human aquariums, and that's their own value. Um,
Mhm.
and and um, and I'm wondering what the legal implications, if you tease this out down the road, we're getting into handmaid territory where authorities might go looking through your trash for pregnancy tests. And we've already seen discussions of authorities monitoring menstrual cycle apps and looking for behavior, maybe after the fact, after there's a court case of young women who seek abortions, or who are looking for some other means of dealing with what they regard as a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, so there's obviously the sort of dystopian handmaid scenario where the state really monitors everyone who's pregnant. It seems unlikely that we would see that, in part because some of the lawmakers who pass these laws have family members they want to be able to access abortion, and in part because it's just prohibitively expensive. So the history instead of how these laws are enforced is equally dystopian, but it's really a story of selective enforcement. So we've started to see this in some of the lawsuits that have been filed, wrongful death and other lawsuits, by folks who are angry that their partners or exes or others are having abortions. And often what you see is that these laws about personhood are leveraged for advancing really personal agendas, right? Whether that's people who are unhappy in relationships and want to exit them, or people who are trying to exert control in relationships where they're losing it, or people who are, I mean, in the past, it's been people who are angry that their partners are having affairs with other people. So these laws, I think, sometimes also end up being kind of invitations to things like blackmail and bounty hunting, in part because the political will to actually enforce a personhood style law on its face is just so lacking that you instead see prosecutors behaving opportunistically. That's also evident, I think, in the way we're already seeing more prosecutions for pregnancy-related conduct. So while a lot of conservative states have carve-outs saying we're not going to punish women for abortion, they don't have carve-outs for a range of other behaviors. So people in the name of fetal personhood face criminal punishment for substance use during pregnancy, for when they miscarry at home, not treating fetal remains with whatever the state thinks is the appropriate method or showing of respect. Um, People who are burying fetal remains and being prosecuted for things like desecrating a corpse. People who are being prosecuted for things that sound like murder or neglect because of decisions they make during pregnancy, like getting in a physical altercation or, having a glass of wine and falling down the stairs. So that's all selective prosecution too. People are not, wealthy women are not being prosecuted for things like that for taking Tylenol during pregnancy against doctor's orders, right? So I think if you're trying to imagine what this dystopian prosecution world would look like, it would look like that, right? It would look like people being opportunistic and laws being unfairly applied.
And you do see the law applied very oddly. For example, you may have a manslaughter or murder charge if a woman is murdered and her 8-month-old viable fetus dies as well. Whereas you're not going to have that happen for a woman who's a month pregnant or 2 months pregnant. And we've had cases in California and in Texas as well, I think, where pregnant women have argued that they should be able to use the carpool lanes
Yep.
because they are pregnant with a person, and the judges have essentially laughed them out of the courtroom. So there are so many pitfalls and traps awaiting any legislation like this.
There are, and I think again, one of the things that's clear in the pattern is that often you will see states saying, just because we're saying a fetus is a person doesn't mean that pregnant women get to benefit from that, right? So just because, we can put a doctor in jail for mailing you the pills doesn't mean you get to drive in the HOV lane. The other thing you uncover is that these sort of not constitutional ideas of personhood, but just other ideas of personhood in are lots of laws, even in blue states, and they're kind of contradictory. So when a fetus is a person in one context is not when a fetus is a person in another context. So trying to make all of that make sense will also be kind of a disaster, I think, if we go
Including your tax deduction on your taxes if you're 2 months pregnant.
Right.
So although that, who knows, that would be the extreme from, I would think, from point of view of an absolutist in the fetal parenthood movement. So let's get to some wonderful questions. Let's see, Ruth and a lot of others. What is to stop Trump from issuing executive orders that allow red states to impinge on other states' pro-abortion rights laws? I guess that would be the federal courts.
Yeah, I mean, a combination of political limitations and the federal courts. So Trump has shown what I think is sort of remarkably little interest in really aggressive moves on abortion, given how little concern he's had about taking unconstitutional actions in other contexts, right? There has been no move on limiting access to mifepristone. Bobby Kennedy has repeatedly said that the FDA is looking into it, but there's been no official moves made to investigate, right? It's just sort of like a scout's honor, we're looking into it. There have been no moves made on the Comstock Act, and there easily could be, right? All it would take would be for the Office of Legal Counsel to issue a memo. So I think there's a real sense that Trump has had that doing something splashy on abortion will only hurt Republicans in the midterm. In fact, in that big case about abortion pills that's before Judge Kaczmarek, the Trump administration actually has gone on record to say they want the case dismissed, right? They don't want to deal with it. It's a political headache for them. Whether the Supreme Court would limit what Trump is doing, if Trump, for example, were to say, I think the Comstock Act is an abortion ban, and I am going to start prosecuting through DOJ anyone who's mailing abortion pills or receiving abortion pills via telehealth, the Supreme Court could theoretically stop that. I don't know if the Supreme Court would. That's an interesting question, too.
Really?
Again, I mean, the court has been very reluctant to say no to Trump on almost anything. Then again, the court has also been not exactly chomping at the bit to take on more big abortion cases after overruling Roe. They've found kind of procedural escape hatches for a lot of things. That in part may have been because all of those cases were in an election year, in a presidential election year. I don't know if that trend continues, but I think the biggest thing standing between Trump and some kind of backdoor abortion ban is simply the fact that voters would rebel. So this is a scenario where people making clear that that would be unpopular
On,
is what's stopping. I think that's true of congressional Republicans too.
on the other hand, we've seen states where voters have reaffirmed their support for
Yeah.
abortion rights, and state legislatures, conservative legislatures, have overruled them and said they have raised the level to 2/3 in which these initiatives have to pass. They've done everything to create a runaround to block the will of the voters.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a sign of how singular partisan control in some states is, right? So one of the weird features of our democracy in some of these states is that voters would choose overwhelmingly to vote in favor of reproductive rights ballot initiatives and also vote overwhelmingly to re-elect state legislators who had passed laws criminalizing abortion. So the message, the takeaway for those conservative legislators is one, that their position on abortion is deeply unpopular, but also two, that there are no consequences for them for taking the deeply unpopular position. And there are, in fact, consequences for them if they back away from the deeply unpopular position, because they could face a primary threat. The anti-abortion movement does that a lot. They could lose the support of conservative Christian donors who fund their campaigns. So we are in a dynamic, because some of those states have so little partisan competition, where they just operate differently from national Republicans, right? I mean, if you think about the bill that just at least temporarily defunded Planned Parenthood, the way and women from safe seats reacted to that proposal was radically different than the reaction of folks from contested seats in places like New York and California, because they thought it was political suicide, right, to take this on. So national Republicans still have to win elections in a way that a state lawmaker from Missouri just does not.
Lisa wants to know, do you really mean that there's no hope in getting women's rights back in terms of abortion without the intervention of the Supreme Court? And the court doesn't seem to be much on the side of that. And in a sense, would the court ever back away from what it's already done?
Well, not this court. I mean, I'm a big believer that the Supreme Court um, I mean, the Supreme Court is and always has been deeply political, right? So if you're thinking about how to get back to a reality where there is some kind of national protection for abortion rights, it's necessarily going to involve political organization, right? Like you can't win at the Supreme Court without that. In the short term, what difference can you make? I mean, these ballot initiatives are helping. There's a lot of state constitutional litigation that's yielding pretty cool and surprising results. So there have been wins for abortion rights in state courts in places like North Dakota and Utah, which are not, bastions of progressive sentiment and feminism, right, on abortion rights, but the courts are seeing the importance of this. And I think grassroots organizing too, because again, I don't know if, at a minimum, I think people being angry about what's happened with reproductive rights has meant that things have not gotten worse. That's what's stopping Trump and Congress. It's not that the Supreme Court may stop them. It's the fact that they're afraid of what voters will do. And I think that's what's driving access in some of these states. There is, I think, going to be I'm in fact pretty sure that there will be a time when there are federal reproductive rights once again. I think that may take a generation because of who's currently on the Supreme Court, and because I think it's likely that you would either need federal legislation or a federal Supreme Court decision. But I think over the kind of long arc of justice, the courts tend to land on opinions that the American people hold. And there's been, as you mentioned at the very beginning, very little sign that voters want all of these procedures to be criminalized in the way that they have been. And even fewer of them do now once they understand what that criminalization looks like in practice.
One of our listeners, Judge Joe, we've been talking about the Comstock Act, 150 years old, wants to know about the 60-year-old Griswold versus Connecticut Supreme Court ruling, which gave doctors the right to talk to married women about birth control. This was not even all women, just married women at that point, and wonders what the future of that is, because we've built so much of
Mhm.
Supreme Court precedent and our public behavior essentially on the presumption of a right of privacy, which is not enumerated. The originalists apart, there are other specifics that they get hung up on, but this one in particular, so much of our public behavior is now predicated on that Griswold and other rulings.
Yeah, it is under threat. I mean, I don't think it's as much of a priority for the conservative Christian legal movement as same-sex marriage is. So there's a lot of energy right now in dismantling sex discrimination jurisprudence. A lot of the litigation about transgender identity has turned into a vehicle, not only for changing how transgender people are treated, but also for just making it easier for states to discriminate against people because of their sex, because they're men or women. There's a lot of energy around undoing same-sex marriage. There's a major conservative Christian litigation group that's launched a campaign to overturn the Supreme Court's decision on same-sex marriage, Obergefell. On contraception, I think there is some energy around that. Clarence Thomas wants to do that. I think the anti-abortion movement is less concerned about that, in part because the definition of abortion is so fuzzy. More than a dozen states have changed their definitions of abortion since Roe was overturned. So the easier move, I think, is for abortion opponents to simply say, you know, we're against abortion, and it turns out that all the contraceptive drugs you're using are actually abortifacients. That's been kind of the go-to move. We're starting to see a slow erosion when it comes to access for minors. That's been kind of the first wave of efforts to prohibit contraceptive access or change contraceptive access. But I think if you're looking for kind of what's next to go, it's going to be things like it being legal to not allow women into medical school, or it being illegal for same-sex couples to marry in states like Alabama. Again, I think those are some of the priorities you're going to see on the kind of right to privacy front the movement's pursuing.
I wonder whether IVF offers an opportunity for the opposition to it, because so many IVF patrons are also same-sex couples, and they can use that as a driving wedge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's been interestingly a lot of weird coalition politics in the world of IVF around genetic parenthood. So IVF, of course, has introduced a lot of questions about what rights people have to know their biological parents when they're donor conceived. And that's a question, of course, that raises lots of questions about identity, that intersects with questions about adoption and race and so on. But abortion opponents are really leveraging that to say that you should not be allowed to use IVF unless you have a genetic male and a genetic female parent, which of course is a backdoor way of precluding same-sex couples from using IVF, but it's designed to resonate with people who feel that biology matters in this unique way, in the way we create children now. So I think you're going to see more conversation. That's in Project 2025, that argument. And you're starting to see it emerge in proposals about how IVF should be changed if IVF is permitted at all.
You have a question from another Mary Ziegler, who may be a doppelganger. I don't know.
Oh, creepy. Is it like, yeah, let's hang out.
Whether the US is an outlier when it comes to this dystopian legal framework toward reproduction. And I think it's of the paradox of many old countries which have been traditionally, legally, and officially religious countries. They have an official religion, which have moved away from that. And their politics are much less religiously based than the United States, which never had a legal official religion, but has thought of itself as much more religious than many current day countries of equivalent income, education, and other standing.
Yeah, it's also partly a story about how the US is so enamored with putting everyone in prison, right? So there are some other countries that have said, so Ireland at one point had full-blown constitutional fetal personhood that was then undone by a national referendum. But you have some countries where you had courts recognizing fetal personhood, like in Germany and to a lesser degree, sort of South Korea. But then courts there looked and said, but it's really weird that doesn't follow that you have to criminalize abortion from that. They would say criminalizing abortion doesn't seem like it works to protect fetal life. It doesn't really seem to be the most effective tool for achieving that. There's certainly less restrictive ways of trying to get people not to have abortions, like making it easier for pregnant people to keep their jobs. So the US is an outlier, I think, in part because the US is more religious, but also in part because the US just loves the solution being, you know, incarcerating people, right? The idea that even if you assume that there are constitutional fetal rights, which is not a common assumption for courts in other nations to make, where that's true, a lot of the times courts don't see why the solution is the kind of draconian punishment that abortion opponents are imagining in the United States.
Lisa and others want to know whether you think abortion is a red herring for the Republican Party, using it as a tool to organize and galvanize their masses to vote for their candidates. We've seen this going on for 40 years in terms of ballot measures that are get out the vote measures for guns, or in many cases, abortion as well.
Yeah, I do in a way. I mean, less less so now in the sense that Trump was pretty open about not promising anyone in the anti-abortion movement anything, but there's been a sort of it was a more effective, perfect ruse for Republicans while Roe was the law, because Republicans could promise the world and say, we would do all of this for you if only we could. But now, of course, they can, right? So an interesting question is if a politician who is less beloved by the Republican base than Donald Trump did what Donald Trump is doing, which is essentially not much from the standpoint of the anti-abortion movement, after suggesting that they could do more, is that going to convince some voters to stay home? It didn't with Trump, but again, Trump, I think, is unique in the Republican Party in terms of the amount of loyalty and affection base voters have for him. Whether that would translate for someone like, you know, J.D. Vance or Josh Hawley, I think, is a live question. But I do think that's something that Republicans have been doing for a long time, but in more ways than one. I think we're dealing with a dog who caught the car moment post Roe, and we're seeing Republicans really have to navigate what to do now that in theory they can give the anti-abortion movement much more of what it wants.
Well, certainly post Dobbs, it's be careful what you wish for, it might come true.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Gerald and a couple of other people point out what we were discussing earlier about a tax deduction for an embryo or a zygote, and he says, and then referring to the Constitution, with every fertilized egg, embryo, and fetus must be counted in the census toward the determination of members of the House of Representatives. How do those who advocate for personhood of a fetus respond to that? This is a lot of stuff in motion.
Yeah, I mean, the way they usually try to do it is by cabining it to say it's just the equal protection and due process clause, because in a lot of the rest of the relevant parts of the Constitution uses the word citizen, and only in these parts of the 14th Amendment does it use the word person. That isn't really true, because there are lots of other parts of the Constitution that use the word person that in theory could apply to fertilized eggs too. The short answer is they don't really have an answer, because until recently, fetal personhood was the moonshot, right? This was sort of, I don't know what the equivalent would be. Maybe it's a two-state solution. Maybe it's something that people see as would be a great thing, but is so impossibly unlikely in the near term that people can never iron out the finer points of what it would look like. So no one really thought through in the anti-abortion movement what it would mean for the census, or if it would mean anything for the census, because no one was thinking it was possible. Roe ended more quickly than anybody thought would be the case. And now all of a sudden, fetal personhood in certain contexts, whether that's state courts or state legislatures, is a realistic possibility right now. So sometimes the movement hasn't hammered out those details. Sometimes people in the movement disagree with one another, right? Which is why we're starting to see public disagreements about what personhood ought to mean that we didn't see, before 2022.
Combining a couple of points, Clyde in Davis, where you teach, and Diane, the question that we touched on about pregnant women who drink alcohol, use drugs, endanger the fetus. We have seen prosecutions of that already without any kind of fetal personhood legislation during the crack epidemic in the 1980s, which of course was disproportionately affecting the minority communities in cities like Los Angeles. And so were the prosecutions, or selective prosecutions of a prosecutor who wants to make a point about, I am protecting the unborn. So how far do you think such fetal personhood laws could take us in that direction? Would women have to wear monitors and be kicked out of bars if they showed up and ordered anything but a ginger ale?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I mean, I imagine it would be selective enforcement, which is what we've already been seeing. One of the other kind of scary features of the idea of fetal personhood being enforced the way some people imagine it is so much would be left to the discretion of individual prosecutors, right? We're seeing in some instances prosecutors in places like Nevada using what sound like fetal personhood logic in prosecutions. So it's unclear how far it will be taken. We have seen a pretty significant increase in these kind of personhood adjacent prosecutions since the decision of Dobbs. They absolutely have been going on for a while, and that's in part because the anti-abortion movement has always been pursuing personhood, right? So the idea was that if you had non-abortion protections for fetuses in the law, that would make it easier later to make the Supreme Court a case that said you should have protections in every law, right? To make the law consistent. So that's always been ongoing. It's going on more now, and that's unsurprising because now there's more of an upside for abortion opponents, right? So if you win these cases, you're not only winning a prosecution, you're also putting a stone in that foundation toward the recognition of fetal personhood in lots of other cases or constitutionally. So there's been a ratcheting up, even though it's not a new phenomenon.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I want to slip in this question before we wrap up. Just today, Texas moved to allow anyone to sue abortion pill prescribers and distributors, which goes back to your point about, pissed off boyfriends, or for that matter, angry in-laws. If you can just give us a minute on where that looks like it would be going.
Yeah, so that bill looks like it's going to pass. It's based on an earlier bounty bill called Texas's SB 8, and it's designed to let literally anybody sue pill manufacturers, abortion funds, anybody in the kind of um, process that makes it possible for people to get abortion pills. Is it going to work is an interesting question. And the reason I'm skeptical is in part because there have never, one, people in blue states are not convinced that these state laws will hold up as compared to their own state laws protecting them. Number two, we've seen relatively few people bringing lawsuits under laws like this, and the people who have tended to be kind of a rogues gallery. So if people want to email me, I will send you some of the really bonkers facts in some of these cases where people have already been suing prior to the passage of this bill. Um, it's not the kind of thing most people want to do. They don't want to expose the details of their relationships and reproductive decisions to scrutiny like this. So often, the flip side of this being used in a kind of selective, uncomfortable way is that the plaintiffs who are filing these lawsuits under laws like this are not appealing characters and sometimes are bad PR for these laws.
Yeah.
So whether this is going to be the solution abortion opponents are looking for to stop the flow of pills into red states, I'm still pretty skeptical. I think that ultimately they need either the Supreme Court or the Trump administration, or arguably both, or we're going to be in a kind of war of attrition between blue states and red states for the foreseeable future.
The phrase soft secession has been used about how different states choose to interpret human rights, individual rights, constitutional rights, women's rights,
Mhm.
etc., civil rights. In the minute or so we have left, we always try to end on something positive, as you will remember. So perhaps there's something you can offer us, and you have to come back because there's so many questions still outstanding. And as we know, this is something completely in motion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be positive about. I mean, I think I was convinced before Roe was overturned that voters simply didn't care about this issue and that they would simply let women die if they could save a few dollars at the pump or something. And instead, I think what you've seen is that voters are mad and politicians are scared that voters are mad. And that is not solving all the problems. It is not making sure that people can have safe pregnancies or that it's safe to have a miscarriage or use IVF. But it is creating some limits on how bad things get. And that suggests to me that if we're more outspoken and we push back harder, that politicians will react to that too. So this is one of the areas, surprisingly, where I think the system is still responding to the will of the people. And that means that if this is something you care about, your voice can still be heard, I think, in an even bigger way than it already has been.
Mary Ziegler's book is is Personhood, the New Civil War Over Reproduction. Hope to have you back soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to anytime. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks to all of you for watching and supporting these programs. You'll see on the screen our upcoming programs and a variety of topics and timely ones as well. We hope you will join us for those topics as well and support in any way you can what it is that we do here, the mission of JUDJ's programs. Thank you very much. I'm Pat Morrison. Appreciate you watching and listening this evening.